Jak and Daxter: The Precursor Legacy was released for the PlayStation 2 in 2001 and developed by Naughty Dog of Crash Bandicoot fame. Following the success of the Crash Bandicoot games on the original PlayStation, Naughty Dog wanted to introduce a new franchise for the PlayStation 2 and began working on various concepts and ideas for a game that would eventually become Jak and Daxter, which released to critical acclaim. In this review, I'm going to be looking at Jak and Daxter in depth and discussing what it got right, what it got wrong, and examining what makes it such a classic entry in the PlayStation 2 game library.
I have spent my life searching for the answers that my father and my father's fathers failed to find. Who were the precursors? Why did they create the vast monoliths that litter our planet? How did they harness eco, the life energy of the world? What was their purpose, and why did they vanish?
The game begins with Samos talking about a mysterious ancient civilization called the Precursors and how he believes that Jak is destined to discover who they were and what their purpose was. It's here that you're introduced to Jak and Daxter, who are sailing to an island against Samos' wishes. Just so happens that the antagonists are also on that same island, and they're searching for Precursor artifacts. Jak and Daxter are exploring and stumble across a pool of dark eco where they're attacked by a lurker, causing Daxter to fall into the pool and turn into an Ottsel.
Man, that stung! I told you we shouldn't have come here, and you listened! What?
They scurry back to their home and tell Samos what's happened, and Samos explains that a sage who lives to the north is the only person capable of turning Daxter back, and this starts the events of the game. For all intents and purposes, it's a good introduction to the game and does a good job of setting up the characters and the world that they live in. A quest to turn Daxter back to normal is an interesting premise, and we know that Samos believes that Jak has some sort of great destiny to fulfill, which teases a much bigger story waiting to unfold. The voice acting here and throughout the rest of the game is particularly good, and I'm personally a fan of the way that Daxter is written.
We won't find any more of that dark gooey eco stuff, will we? Cause I'd hate to fall in again and turn into you!
Get in there!
So, Samos sends Jak and Daxter out to Geyser Rock for some training before they set off on their main adventure. Geyser Rock is the game's tutorial level, and it does a generally good job of introducing the player to the core mechanics of the game. You're presented with an open space to run and jump around in before you move towards the collectibles, and this allows you to get accommodated with how the game controls and how it feels. Movement in Jak and Daxter is something I feel the development team put a lot of work into. The controls are responsive and intuitive, and simply moving around the environment is fun in and of itself. With that said, double jumping feels kind of temperamental. For whatever reason, there are moments where the second jump simply doesn't happen. Although these moments are rare, it's incredibly noticeable in a game that's so heavily based around jumping, and it can lead to some pretty frustrating deaths that feel completely undeserved. One thing I love about this tutorial is that the combat is never explicitly mentioned by the characters. Instead, there are dummies placed around the level with targets painted on them, and the player can naturally assume that they're to be broken in some way. It's a simple and effective method of introducing combat to the player that never really feels intrusive or patronizing. It's a shame then that the same design philosophy wasn't applied to teaching the other gameplay elements. The game suddenly pauses to explain what precursor orbs are, and then power cells, and then a menu pops up telling you about autosaving, and all of this happens within the first 2 minutes of the level. It doesn't pause to explain what the scout flies are, however, so I don't see why the game pauses for those specific items. It's a nitpick, but it breaks the flow of a tutorial which is an otherwise solid experience, and it slows the game down if you've played it more than once. The final mechanic you're introduced to is Blue Eco, which is an interesting way of interacting with the environment as opposed to the button pushing and lever pulling that's prominent in a lot of 3D platformers. On top of increasing your movement speed, getting charged with Blue Eco breathes life into the various structures around you and also acts as a magnet for nearby precursor orbs. Watching precursor technology piece itself together and activate as you walk near it is a unique twist on navigating environments, and I think it ties the platforming mechanics together nicely. The speed boost provided by Blue Eco is perfectly implemented in that it's fast enough to add a sense of flow to the platforming, but never so fast that it feels overwhelming to control. Since I'm discussing the core elements of the game, I want to use this chance to talk about the way the camera functions. The development team decided to create a system that didn't force the player to have to control the camera, and the result is a camera that moves around automatically to accommodate the environment if you don't move it around manually using the right analog stick. If a piece of scenery is obstructing the gameplay, then the camera moves so the player can see what's happening, and it keeps a focus on the action. For the most part, the camera does a good job of what it's supposed to do, and it definitely stands out amongst other games that were released at the time. In the few incidents where the camera does glitch out, it never really affects the gameplay for more than a few seconds. After completing the tutorial, it's back to Sandoval Village, where Samos politely suggests that you explore and talk to the locals.
Now, all of you, get out of here!
Sandoval Village is essentially a hub area that branches out to the Forbidden Jungle, Sentinel Beach, and eventually Misty Island. Your main objective here is to gather power cells so that you can progress further north, and you're left to do this at your own pace. Jak and Daxter has an entirely open world with no loading screens. There's no level select menu or time limits to pressure you into finding power cells, and instead there's a heavy emphasis on exploration. Talking to the various characters in Sandoval Village gives you an idea of how vast the world is. Kira tells you about the Forbidden Jungle, the Stonemason tells you to find his muse on Misty Island, and the Old Woman tells you about Sentinel Beach. So before you've even left the starting area, you already know that this is a large world to explore with a lot going on. I think that subtly encouraging the player to explore through gameplay is one of the main strengths of Jak and Daxter. Precursor orbs function like breadcrumb trails to lead you into the various areas to explore, and on top of that, the mission to herd yakkows in Sandoval Village forces you to look around the area, and doing this causes you to stumble across the entrance to the Forbidden Jungle. The Forbidden Jungle is where I think the game really starts to shine, mainly because it's kind of a showcase for how connected the game world is. So, one of the first things you see in this area are these vines growing out of the ground. They're not exactly threatening, they don't really try to attack you, and they only really damage you if you run into them. Defeating the Dark Eco Plant causes these vines to wither, and it shows that some of your actions are going to have permanent consequences. It makes the world feel organic. This concept is put into more practical use when you activate the blue eco vents underground. Doing this in the Forbidden Jungle activates the eco vent on Sentinel Beach, and that lets you get an additional power cell when you eventually go to that area. The jungle is also home to the fishing minigame, and there's not really a great deal to say about it apart from that completing it gives you access to the Misty Island by way of the fisherman's speedboat. It's a pretty simple minigame that really has no challenge beyond avoiding the eels, and they feel kind of cheap. Regardless of how well you're doing, catching an eel instantly ends the minigame, and really they only exist to put you in a bad mood. There are minigames in almost every level of Jak and Daxter, and whilst they add some variety to the platforming, they feel kinda tacked on. They're not exactly challenging and offer no incentive to replay them after you've got a power cell from each one. It would have been nice to see them offering various amounts of precursor orbs depending on how well you play them. It's a small touch, but it would have added a layer of depth to the entire experience. The main focal point of the Forbidden Jungle is the Precursor Temple, and whilst the only things to do here are activating the blue eco vents and defeating the Dark Eco Plant, I think that the Precursor Temple is part of a whole host of fantastic examples of environmental storytelling. Precursor technology is absolutely everywhere, left behind by a mysterious civilization that's vanished off the face of the Earth. The intro to the game introduces the Precursors as a strange, ancient race of beings that once lived on the planet, and seeing their technology scattered around the levels gives them a sense of character. You don't know who the Precursors were, but they definitely had an impact. By the end of the game, you don't know much more about the Precursors than you did to begin with, and I think this is a nice touch to the narrative. Samos says that he spent his life searching for more information about the Precursors, and to have their secrets revealed in the space of a single game would have felt pretty anticlimactic. After finishing the Forbidden Jungle, the next area to explore is Sentinel Beach, which is in my opinion one of the nicest looking locations in the game. For the most part, I feel that the graphics in Jak and Daxter have really stood the test of time, mainly because of its use of stylized, cartoonish visuals. Each level is colourful and fun to explore, and the game runs at a mostly consistent, smooth frame rate. There's a day and night cycle in the game that has no impact on gameplay, but adds a nice level of visual diversity to the environment. If you're taking your time exploring each area, it's difficult to get bored of how it looks because of the way the lighting changes and affects the atmosphere of the area. The term living, breathing world is thrown around a lot in the gaming media these days as a kind of hyperbolic statement to make a game seem more exciting, but Jak and Daxter is one of the few games that I feel lives up to that promise, and it's the little things like the day and night cycle that create the impression that this is a world that continues to exist whether you're playing or not. Anyway, arriving at Sentinel Beach sees you smashing open a group of crates with blue eco and then finding a bunch of metal boxes on the sand. Using the exploding bags fired from the cannon to open the metal boxes is a nice way to demonstrate that the strong boxes aren't easily opened and that they contain valuable items. This also serves as a discrete tutorial that teaches you how to use the cannon later on in the level. You can jump up to the cannon and use it to blow up the strong boxes on the stone pillars to collect a few more precursor orbs, and when you gain control of the cannon you already know what it's used for. It's in Sentinel Beach that you're introduced to diving and the uppercut move. The uppercut is taught to the player by using it to push wooden poles up from underneath the ground that you can then use as platforms to get some precursor orbs and a scout fly. The uppercut is performed by hitting the jump button whilst punching, and this feels fluid and intuitive. It makes sense that the button associated with ascending combined with the punch command executes an uppercut move. It's a shame that the wooden poles are the only puzzle that uses the uppercut throughout the entire game because it's practically useless in combat. Diving is straightforward and works pretty much how you'd expect, although I find it strange that the game shows the player that there are precursor orbs in the water and then punishes the player for swimming out too far. This is admittedly a nitpick, but it's a shame that exploring the water wasn't used to its full potential. The lighthouse has an archway in the middle which draws you to swim towards it, only to get eaten by a giant fish. And I get the impression that the lighthouse originally had a fully explorable interior at some point in development, although that's just speculation. An interesting feature of Sentinel Beach is that it seems to be designed around preventing you from dying. The green eco vents instantly bring you back to full health, and there's barely any threats in the level, which might mean that Sentinel Beach was intended to be the first level that you play to get a feel for the mechanics outside of a tutorial level setting. I think that this highlights one of the benefits of having an open world structure as opposed to a stage select screen. Since you can only access Misty Island after playing through the Forbidden Jungle, this means that you only have two choices when it comes to deciding which location to visit first. Some players will head towards Sentinel Beach, whilst others will play through Forbidden Jungle. If you find the Forbidden Jungle too challenging, then you're free to go towards Sentinel Beach instead to get used to the game before heading back to tackle the more challenging level. This potentially removes the possibility of getting frustrated with the game in its first hour, which can ultimately sour the entire experience, because you'll always have the easier option to fall back on. There are no punishments for choosing Sentinel Beach over Forbidden Jungle, which means that the player is allowed to play at their own pace without feeling bad for picking the easier option. The final level branching off from Sandoval Village is Misty Island, which you reach by using the Fisherman's Speedboat. Atmospherically speaking, Misty Island is a much darker area than the previous two levels, and it's here that the game's difficulty starts to ramp up slightly. Compared to Sentinel Beach and Forbidden Jungle, there's a lot more actual platforming here, and there's also a lot more combat. It's also where you first encounter Red Eco, which is probably one of the more useless additions to the game. A temporary damage increase sounds helpful in theory, but it loses most of its practical application when you realise that most enemies die in 1 or 2 hits anyway. It's only really useful when you get to the arena and have to fight a large group of enemies in order to get a power cell. This arena fighting section highlights a small issue with combat, and that's that the recovery time after punching is a little too slow, and there are no invincibility frames in that time, which means that fighting a group of enemies in a cramped space can cause you to lose health unfairly. Thankfully, this kind of situation is rare in most of the levels, but it's still worth mentioning. There's a nice touch in Misty Island that links back to the opening cutscene of the game where Jack and Daxter discover the pool of dark eco. If you look closely at the background during the cutscene, you can see an area with barrels tumbling down ramps, and this is actually an area that you can play through when you eventually get to Misty Island. It's a small touch, but it keeps with the theme of an interconnected world. If you see something in the distance, chances are you're going to be able to travel to that area at some point, which was a pretty big scope for a game to cover at the time. That the game manages to pull this off with no loading screens, or at least some very well hidden loading screens, is a big technical achievement, and I feel that it's one of the things that sets this game apart from other platformers released at the time. Another new mechanic introduced in Misty Island is the Agrav Zoomer. The zoomer itself is nice to control and it handles pretty well, and the driving sections are a nice distraction from the platforming that you do throughout the rest of the game. My only real complaint about the zoomer is that I hate the noise that it makes. The engine hums at a constant pitch, which is fine for this short driving section, but later on there's an entire level based around using the zoomer, and that's when it starts to get irritating. Of course, this is just personal preference, but I think that exposing someone to a constant high-pitched humming noise for extended periods of time isn't exactly a great idea. Climbing onto the zoomer is quick and painless, and it's nice to see that it doesn't fall victim to pausing the game for several seconds so you can watch an animation of your character getting onto a vehicle. Misty Island is likely the last level you'll play through before moving on to Rock Village, and in order to get to Rock Village you have to travel through Fire Canyon on the zoomer, so I suppose this area in Misty Island is a tutorial of sorts to get you used to the way the zoomer handles before driving it through a more intense level. The precursor orbs leading off from the ramps allow you to get familiar with controlling the jump arc of the zoomer, and also let you get a feel for how the physics work whilst driving. Crashing into the lurkers demonstrates that you can damage enemies by driving into them, and the mines attached to the blimps let you know that you're not invincible whilst driving and that there are obstacles to avoid. All of this is to say that by the time you've cleared this area, you have a good understanding of how driving works and are more than prepared to tackle the more difficult driving challenges later on. After clearing the driving section, there's not much else to do in Misty Island other than find the cannon and use it to collect some more precursor orbs. I like the way that Misty Island loops around so that the final task in the area sits just above the arena that you fought in earlier, meaning that once you've finished all of the objectives you can hop down to the arena and then take a small walk back to the speedboat to leave the level. It's a more streamlined approach to level design compared to the rest of the areas in the game, but I think it offers a nice change of pace. You spent the last 1 or 2 levels exploring the environment thoroughly, looking for precursor orbs and scout flies, and Misty Island is a more streamlined opportunity to test the skills you've learned up until this point. So once you've collected enough power cells to power the heat shield on Kira's Zuma, you're all set to travel further north to find the sage that can help Daxter. Before I move on to Rock Village, I want to talk a bit about Jack and Daxter as characters. They're a fairly stereotypical set of characters, with Jack being the strong, silent type and Daxter being the wisecracking, sarcastic sidekick. Despite this being a common trope, I think it works nicely here, and the dynamic between the two of them actually contributes towards the gameplay rather than just being a part of the narrative. Since Jack is a completely silent protagonist, Daxter behaves as the exposition. I love that he's always on Jack's shoulder, journeying alongside you. It helps to establish a bond between these two characters. From the very beginning, just from the way they act together, you can tell that they're both good friends without them even saying a word to each other, and this is thanks to the charming animation and art style that the game is presented in. Since Daxter is always on Jack's shoulder, he's able to say various things about what's happening around the environment, and this is a nice alternative to pop-up text boxes.
Hey, there's little lightning marks on those posts, and there's lightning coming out of that vent over there. Are you thinking what I'm thinking?
I suppose you could argue that some of the stuff Daxter says can be overly obvious, and there's no denying that it's there to help push the player in the right direction, but in the context of his character, I think it fits. It makes sense that two friends going on an adventure together would talk about what's happening around them and give suggestions on how to proceed past certain points, or how to solve certain puzzles. I'm also a fan of the small bits of dialogue that Daxter occasionally says after you die.
I'll say something really teary at the funeral, like, "How am I gonna get changed back now?"
Jack works well as a silent protagonist primarily because of the way he behaves in cutscenes. His body language is strong and confident, which sets him up as a good main character, but his lack of voice acting allows the player to fill the gaps with their own qualities. It's a nice way to present a protagonist in a game like this, and it makes exploring the world as Jack a more personal experience. The other characters in the game all have a unique charm to them as well, and I think the game stands out amongst other 3D platformers for having as much emphasis on characters and writing as it does on gameplay and level design. The story itself isn't exactly incredible, but it has a simple charm to it that makes it easy to follow, and the characters involved help drive you to want to see it through to the end. Sure, Samos is an asshole, but he's a well-written asshole, and he's always entertaining to listen to. Depending on your perspective of his character, you could say that his constant pessimistic ramblings towards you are a way to encourage you to push forward and prove to him that you can be a hero. Anyway, travelling to Rock Village sees you driving through Fire Canyon, which is a streamlined driving section. It largely serves as a break from platforming and a transition to the next part of the game, and it's nice that there's some variety in the gameplay to prevent the core mechanics from getting stale. Once you arrive at Rock Village, you discover that it's been damaged by flaming boulders being thrown from above the cliffs. The Blue Sage, who's been working on a levitation device to move the boulders, has gone missing, so it's up to you to reverse the damage that's been caused. In order to do this, you need to collect enough power cells to activate the levitation device, and it's here that you start to pick up on a predictable gameplay pattern. Each hub area asks you to collect a certain amount of power cells in order to progress to the next area, with precursor orbs acting as a currency to obtain even more power cells. And this would make it a repetitive collectathon platformer if it wasn't for the constant introduction of new ideas in almost every level. The start of the game sees you doing some basic platforming with simple combat mixed in for good measure, but new ideas and variations on existing gameplay mechanics are brought in to keep the gameplay fresh, and all of this is done at a comfortable pace. By the end of the game, you've thrown fireballs, ridden animals, swung from poles, and driven fast vehicles, and all of these are thrown into a nice difficulty curve that makes the game feel like an adventure. The player, and by extension Jack, masters all of these mechanics, and it's satisfying to look back at the start of your adventure to see how far you've come. I'm not saying that Jack and Daxter is the first game to follow this kind of design philosophy, far from it, but the way that it implements a constantly evolving set of mechanics into a 3D platformer is smooth and seamless. So, much like Sandoval Village, Rock Village behaves like a hub area, this time branching off into the Precursor Basin, Boggy Swamp, and the Lost Precursor City. Compared to the bright tropical aesthetic of Sandoval Village, which had a welcoming atmosphere that eased the player into the game world, Rock Village has a much murkier tone that has a more dangerous vibe to it. It feels like a natural direction for the game to take, with the environment itself becoming harsher, as well as the level design. Other than that, it's your standard hub area, with more characters to talk to that give you insight into the areas surrounding the village, and there are various tasks to complete. And you're free to go off to explore each area in whatever order you want. The first of these areas that I'm going to cover is the Lost Precursor City. This stands out as one of my favourite levels in the game, and I'm always excited to get to it with every playthrough. Getting to the Precursor City sees you swimming towards a large structure sitting in the ocean, and reaching the structure reveals a lift that takes you deep beneath the water and into the city itself. It's a fantastic introduction to the level, and it's a nice progression of the environmental storytelling that I spoke about earlier. The Precursor Temple back in Forbidden Jungle was a relatively calm area, and even after you've restored power to the blue eco vents, it still has a sedate atmosphere, with the only challenge being the fight with the dark eco plant. The Precursor City, on the other hand, immediately feels alive, with vivid yellows, blues and greens lighting up the environment, and it looks fantastic. There's lots of enemies to fight and plenty of moving platforms to jump across, with one of my favourite additions to the game being these double platforms that only rotate when you're standing on one of them. It's a welcome alternative to waiting for platforms to slowly move towards you so you can cross a gap, which is a common design element that many 3D platformers are guilty of. Admittedly, Jak and Daxter has these types of platforms too, and it's a shame that these manual platforms didn't get much use outside of the Precursor City. Having manual control over when the platforms move adds a nice level of agency into the platforming, which makes it far less tedious when you're waiting for the platform to make it to the right place before you can jump onto it. There's also a few new enemies to fight here in the form of the spinner lurkers and the piggyback lurkers. Combat isn't a major part of the game, so fighting these enemies isn't much different to the other enemies before this point, but it's nice to see some diversity in the creature design to keep things interesting. The level concludes with an intense platforming section that sees you climbing up the main spire of the city before a rising pool of dark eco can get to you. I've always found it confusing that dark eco is such a major threat to Jak. In the overall plot, dark eco is explained to be a substance that threatens to corrupt the world if left unchecked, which is fair enough, but from a gameplay perspective it instantly kills Jak if he comes into contact with it. We know that dark eco turned Daxter into an Ottsel, so why doesn't it do the same to Jak? It would have been cool to have the mutagenic properties of dark eco involved with the gameplay somehow. It's explained that Jak can use and manipulate eco in unique ways, so rather than being permanently transformed into an Ottsel, dark eco could have had some temporary effects that gave Jak access to different areas, or some unique ability that let him solve puzzles. I'm not saying the game is worse off for making dark eco nothing but an obstacle to avoid, but it strikes me as some missed potential. On a similar note, Daxter isn't used in the gameplay at all. Other than his occasional bits of dialogue, he's just an extension of Jak's character model, and it would have been nice to see him utilising his small size to squeeze through gaps or something similar, if only to add a bit more charm to his character. This is probably something that was originally planned by the development team, or at least talked about, because it seems unlikely that they'd have him sitting on Jak's shoulder all the time just to provide some comedic relief. Again, the game is great enough as it is, but I can't help but speculate on what Daxter could have added from a gameplay standpoint. Following on from the Precursor City is the Precursor Basin, which stands out against the rest of the levels for being entirely based around driving. The large environment accommodates the zoomer perfectly, and because the zoomer is so nice to control, it's a fun, fast-paced level that's only hampered by the annoying sound of the zoomer that I mentioned earlier. The ring challenges here are fun once you know what you're doing, but for a first playthrough it can feel like trial and error as you drive through the level memorizing where the rings pop up so you can drive through them before they fade away. Making one small mistake can throw you off track, causing the ring to time out, which means that you have to start the challenge from the beginning. There's little room for error here, which can be a good or a bad thing depending on your perspective of difficulty. I suppose you could argue that it encourages skill and punishes incompetence, but given that there's no way to predict where the rings are going to show up other than memorizing their positions, it can feel a little unfair. Ultimately though, it's satisfying to complete these challenges since the rings are placed in areas that see you jumping across gaps and driving along narrow bridges. It's nice to feel that you've fully mastered the zoomer to the point where you can accomplish these kind of things. The other main addition here is the time trial minigame that's fun whilst it lasts but suffers from the problem that the other minigames have. Beyond personal satisfaction, there's nothing to reward you for beating your best time. I suppose given the size and scope of the rest of the game, it's picky to harp on about these small details, but I still think it's worth mentioning. After driving around Precursor Basin, the only area left to explore here is the Boggy Swamp. The Boggy Swamp is one of my favourite examples of how a dark colour palette doesn't necessarily have to mean dull and boring environmental designs. Naturally, being a swamp, dark greens, browns and greys are used liberally, but the great lighting produced by torches and eco-vents bring these colours to life and make the entire level feel just as vivid and visually interesting as the rest of the game. The constant light patter of rain that can be heard ties the whole area together nicely, making it a wonderfully atmospheric level to explore. It's here that you'll find Yellow Eco, which gives you the ability to hurl fireballs, and it's my favourite power-up in the game. The short, punchy sound effect that accompanies throwing a fireball makes it a satisfying power-up to use, and it helps that it's also incredibly powerful. The fireballs themselves lock onto enemies and fly towards them, but this isn't overly obvious, so it gives the illusion that you're just awesome at using the power-up. Since you can only get hit 3 times before you die, this is a worthy inclusion to the Yellow Eco, because having to use pinpoint accuracy whilst running around platforming would probably cause a lot of frustrating deaths. The shooting minigame later on in the level uses Yellow Eco in first-person mode to keep rats from stealing the snacks put down by the redneck swamp guy, for lack of a better term.
On these here parts, Everything that doesn't sink into the mud, that is.
I've said all that needs to be said about the minigames, but at least this one teaches you that you can use the first-person mode in conjunction with the yellow eco, which can help you shoot distant objects. This is useful in the spider cave later on. The boggy swamp is the first level where Jack can swing from poles, and although these might seem like a small addition to the gameplay, I think they bring an awesome feeling of agility to the platforming. Knowing when to jump off the poles is easy thanks to the swinging animation. Jack's body is fairly straight during the animation, so it's easy to judge his center of gravity, allowing you to swing from the poles exactly in the way that you'd expect. After exploring the level, you'll eventually come across the Flut, which you save back in Sentinel Beach. Riding the Flut gives you fast movement speed and an extended jump. It has tight controls and it's fun to use, although it's important to note that Jack's roll jump can actually reach the same distance as the Flut's jump. I've played through the game a fair amount of times, and to my knowledge, the roll jump isn't actually mentioned anywhere in-game, despite it being incredibly useful, not only for reaching faraway ledges, but also for covering large areas of ground in a short time. With that said, it's not necessary to complete the game, so it's nice that it's in there to be discovered by people that experiment with the control scheme. Finishing the boggy swamp gets you enough power cells to activate the levitation device back in Rock Village, allowing you to climb the mountain and confront Claw, who's responsible for throwing the boulders at the village. This is the second boss fight in the game, with the first being the Dark Eco Plant back in Forbidden Jungle, but for me this feels like the first real boss. The Dark Eco Plant feels more like a slightly stronger standard enemy, whereas Claw has a more defined pattern and poses an actual challenge. It's a fantastic fight that sees you using blue eco to construct a precursor bridge across the lava to reach some yellow eco, allowing you to blast Claw with fireballs. I've always loved this fight, and the only thing I can complain about here is that it makes me wish that the game had a couple more boss encounters, if only to use the ecosystem to its full potential in combat. Defeating Claw gives you access to the Mountain Pass, another driving section that takes you to the final hub area, the volcanic crater. Once you reach the volcanic crater and let Samos and Kira in through the warp gate, the antagonists make their second appearance since the beginning of the game. It's revealed that they are Gol and Maya, the people who are supposed to be able to turn Daxter back to normal, only now they're corrupted by Dark Eco and have been driven insane.
Gol is the guy trying to kill us? I'm doomed.
I like the way that the antagonists aren't revealed until pretty late into the game. You saw them at the beginning, but it's never mentioned who they are, and their intentions are fairly ambiguous. It makes them a mysterious force to be reckoned with, and this late game reveal gives the narrative the final push it needs for the player to see it through to the end. So this is the introduction to the volcanic crater, which is fairly empty compared to the previous two hub areas. The only characters to talk to besides Samos and Kira are these miners who, in a shocking twist, are willing to part with a few power cells in exchange for precursor orbs.
Where have I heard that before?
Initially, I didn't like how barren the volcanic crater was, but in hindsight I suppose it makes sense that not many people want to hang around in a dangerous cavern surrounded by large pools of lava. Anyway, the volcanic crater provides access to the Spider Cave, Snowy Mountain, and Golem Maya's Citadel. The Spider Cave is one of the largest levels in the game, with a huge initial chamber to explore that branches out to the large room that houses the Precursor robot. It also boasts some gorgeous lighting effects that are integrated into the gameplay later on with the green light crystals. This is where the platforming becomes more challenging, and your competence with the controls is tested by these small moving platforms that are floating all over the place in the first chamber. The level is mostly designed around precision, not just with the platforming but with the yellow eco as well. Where Boggy Swamp saw you spamming the square button to blast through waves of enemies, Spider Cave requires that you use it more patiently to snipe off the bugs that crawl around the pillars. It's a nice idea and it works nicely for the most part, although the bugs speed up with each hit and this can occasionally make the task frustrating. The room with the large Precursor robot has more precision platforming, tasking you with climbing the scaffolding to reach the top of the robot to collect a power cell. It's a tough climb, but one that's satisfying to pull off once you're familiar with the level. Initially, for me at least, it was a difficult section of the level that seemed to test my patience rather than my platforming ability. But eventually it became a fluid obstacle course that uses collapsing platforms and swinging poles to add a great sense of rhythm to the whole thing. There's also a subtle use of a dynamic soundtrack with a few trumpets that start to play once you reach the top of the robot. The area with the light crystals is probably my favourite part of this level, mainly because it's such a simple mechanic, but it's used to great effect. Punching the crystals causes them to instantly burst to life, scattering the surrounding area with the vibrant green light that lets you navigate the platform safely. The lighting engine in Jak and Daxter provides some gorgeous ambient lighting that helps to bring out the subtle details in the game's overall visual style, and I love that they incorporated the lighting engine directly into the game as a mechanic. Up next is Snowy Mountain, which is the inevitable ice level that seems to be prominent in every platformer. It's not that I have a problem with the theme of snow and ice. On the contrary, I think that snow-themed levels allow for some beautiful-looking environments, and that certainly holds true in Snowy Mountain. My problem here is ice physics. You spent the entire game becoming familiar with how Jack controls and how he moves, only to have a single level be based around rewriting those rules. The same could be said for any game that contains ice physics, and it's not an inherently bad thing, but for me at least, these kinds of levels are usually the least fun to play. To add insult to injury, there's a section in Snowy Mountain that requires precision platforming in conjunction with ice physics, and in my latest playthrough this happened more times than I care to admit. Thankfully though, this is only a small part in a large level that's not only fun to play, but gorgeous to look at. There's a timed platforming challenge that sees the Flut return from Boggy Swamp, and much like the boss battles, this section always leaves me wanting more gameplay involving the Flut. It's a great addition to the game and combines the speed from the Zoomer and the agility and precision from Jack to create a fun diversion from the regular platforming. You can also activate some yellow eco vents, allowing you to go back to Spider Cave and use the newly opened eco vents to smash open some strongboxes to get a few more Precursor Orbs. Once Snowy Mountain and Spider Cave have been completed, there's one last driving section that takes you to Golem Maya's Citadel, the final level of the game. The lava tube is my favourite driving section in the game, mainly because of its setting. The beginning of the lava tube is a molten cavern with branching pathways made of volcanic rock, and as you drive further on it becomes a twisting mechanical complex that sees you using yellow eco to destroy moving barrels filled with dark eco. There are explosive mines to avoid, large gaps to jump, and the constant threat of your Zoomer overheating, and it's a treacherous, exciting final stretch to the final level. Once you've reached the end of the lava tube, you're greeted by an angry Kira who explains that Samos has been kidnapped by Golem Maya, and it's finally time to venture into their citadel to put an end to their plans. The citadel is more or less a test of all the skills you've learned up until this point, and it also introduces these colour-coded platforms that lend a small bit of strategy and pre-planning to the platforming. Landing on a coloured platform causes all of the platforms that share the same colour to fall, so jumping across gaps on these can be pretty stressful if you don't think it through first. The Blue Eco launch pads finally get used to their full potential in a great gameplay section that sees you launching from platform to platform, collecting Precursor Orbs along the way. The main goal of this level is to free all of the sages that have been captured by Golem Maya. Up until this point, the sages have only ever been spoken about, and it's nice to finally meet them in person. It's a shame that they're given such a small amount of screen time, because their small parts of dialogue set them up to be pretty charming characters that would have been fun to interact with a little more before the game was over.
Great piles of Precursor metal! That insidious mechanical creation must not be allowed to wreak its terrible havoc!
One complaint I have here is that for whatever reason, the game seems to pick and choose when it lets Jack grab onto certain ledges. I remember on my first playthrough of this game I'd spent ages on this level purely because it wasn't letting me grab a particular ledge, and it led me to think I was doing something wrong. Turns out that you just have to be extremely precise, and after some practice it became a mild annoyance rather than a game-breaking bug. Once you've freed the sages, they use their powers to open the shield doors to the giant Precursor robot that you saw being built back in Spider Cave. With the shielding down, the robot is now vulnerable to attack, and you also finally get some validation from Samos.
Good work, boys. You're real heroes now.
This is the setup for the final boss fight against Golem Maya, and you have to defeat their robot before it can open up the Dark Eco Silo and corrupt the world. The build-up to the boss is great, which sees you riding up a large elevator up to the top of the Citadel and taking a platform down to the Dark Eco Silo, giving you a full look at the final boss before being able to engage it in combat. The sheer size of the robot is huge and intimidating, although the fight itself isn't exactly difficult. It's a simple matter of shooting it with yellow eco, dodging the blast radius of the bomb it fires, and then repeating this process until it's destroyed. I've never had a problem with the low difficulty of the fight, mainly because I tend to view it as the conclusion to the final level rather than an epic final showdown that stands on its own. The Citadel itself was pretty challenging, and the fight with Golem Maya's robot feels like the natural conclusion to the game. Sure, it's an easy fight, but it's fun, and I think that's the most important thing. Once you've dealt enough damage to the robot, the four sages use their combined power to generate light eco that Jack then absorbs and uses to destroy the robot once and for all, in an awesome cutscene that ends the game on a perfect note.
Do something!
It would have been cool to be able to control Jack when he was powered up with light eco rather than watch him use it in a cutscene, but the cutscene itself is pretty badass. Destroying the robot concludes the game, and Jack and Daxter share a victory dance as they float towards Kira and the sages. Golem Maya are destroyed and pieces return to the world. It's a nice ending to the game, and it's awesome to see Jack and Daxter fully realized as heroes. Daxter decides that the fate of the world is more important than turning himself back to normal, and chooses to remain an Ottsel. It's cool to see Daxter put his own needs aside for the greater good, especially since his transformation into an Ottsel was originally the reason you set out on your adventure. With that said, his newfound sense of selflessness doesn't stop him from getting in the way of Jack and Kira finally kissing right before the credits roll.
Wow! Put it on ice, big guy!
Throughout this review, I found myself saying that this game stands out in the 3D platformer genre rather than saying it stands out as a game in general, and from a purely mechanical standpoint, I'd say this is mostly true. At its core, Jack and Daxter is a fairly simple collectathon platformer that doesn't have too much depth to it beyond collecting a certain number of power cells to progress, but I'd argue that this is the game's biggest strength. It's simple, it's easy to pick up and understand, and it has a great world to explore. Where Jack and Daxter stands out as a game overall is in its storytelling and characters. The Precursor legacy is charming and impossible to play without smiling, and it's for this reason that it's one of my favourite games of all time. What it lacked in mechanical depth, it made up for with a huge, seamless world to explore, charming characters and a wonderful visual design that still holds up to this day. Since its release, it has become a defining title within the PlayStation 2's game library and an all-time classic, and Jack and Daxter are the face of many people's childhood gaming memories. This brings me to the end of my review, and I'd like to thank you for sitting through 35 minutes of me rambling about one of my favourite video games. I hope it's been enjoyable, and I'll see you guys next video.